people who felt for their lives would give the babies away to the Christian families, hoping that the child will survive. But she said, no, either we'll live together or we will die together.
You're watching the Spotlight Network, starring Hollywood's newsman, Logan Crawford.
They now believe a single member.
He works with TV and film legends. And now, Logan's shining the spotlight on the world's top emerging authors and creators.
International were abducted.
This is Spotlight with Logan Crawford, streaming on Roku, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire TV.
I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we are joined by Irena Powell. She is the author of a powerful book. It is called The Daughter Who Sold Her Mother. It is a Holocaust memoir spanning the upheavals of the 20th century. Through her mother's extraordinary journey, war, hiding, false identity, post-war communist Poland, and multiple forced migrations, this book reveals what survival truly costs. It's also a deeply moving personal story about the mother-daughter bond and the emotional legacy carried by the second generation. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Prime 7 Media for helping put her in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support authors like her by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing her amazing book. The links are below this interview. Irena, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Well, thank you for having me. Yes.
It's a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show. The title of the book, The Daughter Who Sold Her Mother, is unforgettable. Explain to us what it means and what moment does it point to?
I know it's a bit of a sort of tricky and intriguing title, but my mother, like many Holocaust survivors, was very reticent to speak publicly about her story. She had this firm belief that nobody who did not live through the period like she did not have the same experiences, would not really be able to comprehend the extent of her suffering. Therefore, she would say to me quite strongly when people approached her, organizations approached her to give evidence, she would say, no, my life is not for sale. So part of the title is taken from her vocabulary. Yet at the same time, I sort of felt that I wanted to bear witness on her behalf. So I took control of her story. I decided I'm going to tell her story. So it's a little bit of an ambiguous title, and it reflects my own unease about taking the story on her behalf when she was so unwilling. Don't misunderstand me. She was an obsessive and compulsive talker, but she would talk to family and friends, people who she felt she needed to tell the story of her life and to communicate it, but not to a wider audience. And when I decided just to finish, to take control of her story, I felt that I started writing when she had already passed away. So and dead cannot speak for themselves.
Right.
So, someone said that the dead are absolutely submissive. We can do with them what we like. So there was this tremendous sense of responsibility on my part that I'm taking it over, taking control of it. I'm going to write it and to publish it. In other words, I'm going to sell her story to the world. And therefore, this may be slightly strange title. I can only hope that she would approve of what I did. I tried to be truthful to facts. I tried to convey what she perhaps went through, but who knows? I did my best.
Yeah. Well, it's a provocative title. It gets people's attention. And your mother's story, I think, is more important today than almost ever before when we see this horrible rise in anti-Semitism across the world. And unfortunately, it's accepted and embraced by large numbers of people. So what's happening in America, what's happening globally is very, very disturbing. And I think the lessons of the Holocaust are more important now than ever before. And things are often compared to a Holocaust. And that, for me, has always been, verboten. The
Yes,
Holocaust was a horrific event that in and of itself, there really is no equal. And it shouldn't be compared or used as a metaphor. The Holocaust was a systemic murdering primarily of Jews in the most cruel fashion you can imagine. And fortunately, your mother survived. And she told you her story, and you told the world her story. And I think it's important. Talk to us a little bit about the lessons the world needs to learn from your mother's story about the cruelty of government at times and the cruelty of other human beings, and also the mercy of other human beings as well.
absolutely, yes. From the very from the very initial period of the war, I mean, there were hundreds of instances where her life hung in balance. Life was sort of on a very narrow path between life and death. But from the very beginning, she felt that people had the power either to be helpful and
Mm.
understanding or to be cruel, and it was in their power. If I may quote, I don't know whether we have enough time, but if I may quote a tiny little story. So she lived in this place called Lvov, which is present-day Ukraine,
Mhm.
and she was an inveterate smoker, cigarette smoker. I was a tiny little baby. She left me on the table. This was already under the German occupation. She left me for a minute because there was a cigarette shop down in the building. She ran down to the building to get a packet of cigarettes, and the two boys who were selling those cigarettes in the shop recognized her
Mm.
because they knew her from before, and they said, "Oh, she is Jewish." They call a policeman. The policeman takes her because she has no right. She has no armband. She's not identified as a Jew. And the policeman takes her to the station. And all the way he is telling her how terrible Jews are, how cruel they are, how they'll have to pay the price. And all the time she was thinking, what will this tiny baby left there for a minute on the table? I was perhaps a few weeks old,
Mm.
do without her. So she was crying. She said, I never cried during the war, but this was the first time where I really cried because I
Yeah.
didn't know what will happen. Well, he takes her to the police station. The policeman there, the commandant there, takes the record, asks her questions in a very sort of neutral fashion, and says, "Okay, I've noted it all down. I will come and check tomorrow whether you are telling the truth, that you are who you are, and we'll check whether the baby is there."
Mm.
And he let her go. Of
Wow.
course, he never came. And my mother says, these are the two attitudes. One condemned the mother, although they knew there was a small baby, and the other man being understanding and letting her go, how people
Yeah.
could react. So
Exactly.
the reactions of people, she felt it was always within human, has human power to behave the way they did behave.
Yeah.
And throughout the war, as I said, there were millions of incidents, but throughout the war, she always came across both attitudes, people who helped and people who were evil and tried to do her harm.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's sick that people would collaborate on something like this. Sick that somebody sees a mother and an infant together and reports them. It's just twisted. It was such a twisted mentality that prevailed Germany at that time and parts of Europe. And, and it's frightening that, like I said, we see shades of anti-Semitism flaring up again. Tell us when the Second World War began, how quickly did life change for Jewish families in Poland based on your mother's experience?
Um, it changed, I would say, very abruptly and very quickly, because my parents were refugees into the eastern part of Poland. When Germany invaded Poland, they sort of went east to the eastern part of Poland, but that was taken over by the Russians. So for about a year and a half to 2 years, there was a relative peace. And my mother always referred to the beginning of the Russo-German War as the real war that began for her. So until that moment, life was relatively peaceful. But she came from the hospital with a tiny baby 2 days before the German attacked Soviet Union without any notice. So in her mind, the motherhood, becoming a young mother, and the war and the suffering the fear that she had for her baby became entwined, sort of indelibly entwined. So there were bombs, and she had to be in the cellar with the tiny baby. She said, I waited for a tiny little bit of space between bombing so that I can run upstairs, warm a little bit of water, wash you quickly, and run back into the cellar. The problem was, of course, these are the days when there were no fridges. She didn't have any milk for the baby. She was suffering from some sort of inflammation. So she had again to go out under the bombs to the nearby villages to try to get a little bit of milk for the baby. She said, on the whole, I was feeding on a little bit, she said, on a little bit of sort of Muslim little bag with water and sugar just to keep me alive. So the stress was immediate as soon as the war began. And then, of course, came the hunger and the various sort of peregrinations and wanderings from place to place, trying to find shelter. And in the end, she found a shelter in a Polish village under an assumed identity. And that was a trauma in itself, because she felt that she was continuously under observation. She had to be continuously on her guard. It was like a performance, telling people she had papers given to her by kindness of an Ukrainian woman. So she was supposed to be a Ukrainian woman, but everybody in the village felt she didn't fit there. She was a town woman. She was not a village woman. She didn't know anything about village life. She didn't know anything about village customs. She didn't know what's a weed, what's not a weed. She would be working. She had to earn her living, so she hired herself as a laborer in the fields, and of course she had no idea. So she was making silly mistakes in trying to thresh the wheat or weed the fields in many ways. She had to pretend that she was religious, go to the church barefoot as local women did. And local people are very inquisitive, so they would ask her, why are you here? What are you doing here?
Yeah.
And, every time she had to invent a different story. And she said she only prayed that next day when they asked her, she could repeat the story. So there were, in my mind, there sort of the fear for the baby, because from the beginning she said, either we'll live together or we'll die together. She never wanted to give the baby away. Lots of people who felt for their lives would give the babies away to the Christian families, hoping that the child will survive. But she said, no, either we'll live together or we will die together.
Yeah.
So that was one thing, fiercely protecting her baby. And the other one was this fighting, creating this fictitious persona, which was very difficult
Yeah.
as well. So it left a very deep psychological mark
Yeah.
on her personality, I think. Yes, the
Yeah.
life in the village. And they were also, she was a single woman, a vulnerable single woman. So there were lots of sexual predators who hooked to, starting with the local policemen and the military people, the local people. So she had to be on her guard that way as well.
Yeah.
And well, so every step of the way, there was a little miracle that saved her.
Yeah.
And she was saved by her wit, perhaps by her humor, by her intelligence, alertness, resolution. So she was an extraordinary woman in that sense, but it took its toll, yes, on her. Yeah.
Amazing stress, amazing strain. The will to stay alive and survive was fueled by her love for you, which is wonderful. What was the most difficult part or the most profound part of the book for you to write?
To write, did you say?
Yes. When you were writing her story, what was the
Yes.
most moving, most touching, or most profound aspect of her life when you were
Right.
sharing it on the pages of the book?
So it wasn't, I must confess, it wasn't the war story, because she was telling me these stories, as I said, obsessively, compulsively, repeatedly. So often trauma leaves sort of imprint on one's mind, and these memories stay there. And she would repeat them in the same formulas and the same words all the time. So it was embedded in my memory, and I could say I wasn't writing it. She was only almost dictating it to me. I was just writing her words. So this part was fairly clear. I think what I found more difficult is to face what happened after the war, because it left such how shall I say, such a mark on her life, that it not only on her life, on my father's life, on the relationship between father and her, the stresses of the war left their imprint, and on the relationships between her and myself. Often when I sort of felt that she was so angry, the anger that she harbored against what happened to her, she would say, "I'm sorry, it's like a thorn in my heart. It cannot be pulled out." It's so she almost couldn't help herself, but
Yeah.
it definitely affected our relationship. And I think writing the book helped me in some way to come to terms with it, to see it as a process. I started reading not only memoirs, but also reports of the doctors and psychiatrists, and this who say that traumatic memories have to be dealt with slowly and carefully in order for them to be worked out from the system. Otherwise, they stay there sort of undigested, and they do not allow you, they almost replace the present. You are always living within those memories. Again, a little example, she was already dying, and I was with her in the hospital, and I was trying to hold her hand and talk to her a little bit. And she says, "Don't bother me now. I am now in Dębica," which was a place where the Germans come with dogs and take us off the train. And I'm only thinking, who should die first? You, not to see me being killed, or me so that I don't see you being killed.
Yeah.
This was, the next day she passed away. So these memories were there continuously, sort of invading the present of our household, and our lives were always seen through that prism. She also had expectations for the sacrifice that she made as a mother throughout her life. She almost subconsciously demanded recognition. She would say, "Well, I cared for you like a most beautiful and delicate and fragile greenhouse plant, and you don't care." So there was never enough, in her view, love returned or care returned. So there were difficult times
Yeah.
between her and me, because I obviously wanted to live my own life and to sort of escape from that trap. But
Yeah.
it was rather difficult, yes.
Yeah. It's hard for her to escape from it, hard for you to escape from it when you've been through such a traumatic experience. Your mother, no doubt, was suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It was a
Nobody,
lot.
yes, nobody knew about it. Nobody
Yeah.
did.
It wasn't
Say,
spoken about,
but
wasn't
were
known
not
about.
available then, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, something happened. Yeah.
Amazing. After the war, what did reestablishing life in communist Poland look like for Jewish survivors?
Well, not many left, not many stayed in Poland, I must say. There were waves of anti-Semitic violence in Poland after the war, which I think have to be acknowledged and recognized. And people who are writing now, scholars who look at this problem now, think that it had to do mainly with possession, because as the Jews were eliminated from the Polish life, the Poles took possession of the properties. And then when they saw Jews returning, they were very unwilling, and they were frightened that they would have to return. So there were acts of very strong anti-Semitic violence and killing after the war, and many Jews left. Some left because they felt they couldn't stay in a place that they called the cemetery of their families and all their loved ones, of their friends. Life is no longer there. So the life as they knew it is no longer there. So what's the problem? They really couldn't psychologically stand to stay. But my parents were very committed left-wingers. They fought before the war. They were in left-wing organizations. They hoped for a better and more fair world, the just world. So after the war, with the change of the regime, they sort of felt we will stay and hope for a better life to ourselves. And I think the tragedy of their lives was that it did not materialize in any way.
Yeah.
The regime was again using Jews as a scapegoat on many occasions uh, to justify their own failures.
Yeah.
It was easy. Jews became an easy target, and the most sort of ignominious wave of anti-Semitism happened in 1968. My mother emigrated once before, thinking that maybe she will live in Israel, but that didn't materialize. She came back. But 1968 was the time when the big anti-Semitic campaign scapegoated Jews, as I say, for the failures of the regime, and most of the Jewish community, the remnants of the Jewish community, those who actually thought they would stay in Poland and live in Poland as Poles, most of them left Poland. My mother used to say, and this was, I think, the most painful event in their lives. I always feel, Hitler came and deprived them of their past lives, of their families, of their homes, of their history. Nothing was left. But then the communist regime deprived them of the future, of the hopes for the future. And my mother used to say, communists succeeded where even Hitler didn't succeed, because Hitler didn't succeed in destroying all the communist Jewish community in Poland, but the communists did. There were no Jews left in Poland after 9. Of course there were, but they're a very tiny minority. So this dream of building a fairer society, unfortunately, did not materialize. And I think this was the biggest tragedy in my parents' life, that towards the end of their lives, they found themselves refugees without jobs, without work, without money, trying to find a shelter somewhere else in the world. And the sort of double tragedy of my parents was that in the end, they ended up in Germany. And they spent the rest of their lives at least until my father's death, living in Germany and trying psychologically adapt to being amongst the Germans. And I think, this is my next project, because my first book ends with them being exiled, expelled from Poland. But the next project is how these two Holocaust survivors coped with Germany that was changing, obviously, and coming to terms with the war and the Holocaust themselves, some sort of reckoning within German society, and on the other hand, how these two people are coping with being in Germany. Sorry, that was a digression, but yes, the communist experiment didn't work out for them.
Yeah. Amazing, amazing. And it's all so frightening that your mother says that where Hitler failed, the communists succeeded. And again, it's communism grows and is even embraced in the United States in some factions. You have to be very, very leery, very, very wary of the fake promises of communism. Your mother eventually joined you in Oxford.
That's right. After my father's death, I brought her to Oxford. And before this interview, I asked my sons what was the most memorable, asking their help, what was the most memorable time for them with their grandmother. And they said the most two interesting parts were her youth in pre-war Poland and her life with us in Oxford, because she had a very strong sense of her Jewish identity, and through her I inherited this faith that, not faith, but belief that it was the Jewish identity that shaped our destiny, not the Polish one. Until I left Poland, I thought it was, I was Polish like anybody else. But since we found ourselves outside Poland and listening to her stories and the tragedy of the life, I realized that it was because it's the Jewish identity, not because, but it's the Jewish identity that played the most important part in our lives. And she tried very hard to pass it on to my teenage, at the time, sons, trying to talk to them in her broken English, to making me read to them, although we spoke Polish, but I would translate it. So her mission was to make them realize that it's part of their identity. And she passed that mission to me, and that's where the book sprang from. I think that I felt I have to pass it on to them as well. The problem was that her story is an individual story, beautiful story of resilience, and and it's through individual story that you can make the history familiar, but we are talking to the generation that's not familiar, that has no idea. 20th century is a distant past for them.
Yeah.
And let alone the part of Europe, Central East Europe, let alone Jewish history. So how to make them understand that individual story by putting enough history and not overloading it with history, not making it into a history treatise.
Right.
Sorry, but to balance the two was another most difficult. You've asked me what was the difficult thing for me. This was also a very difficult thing for me to do, to tell them the story so they understand the story. And you can't understand the decisions or the choices the individual has without understanding the background.
Yeah.
So yes, this is what I was struggling with.
Well, I think the story of your mother is the story of the Jewish people in Europe during World War II and afterwards. Sure, her story is very, very unique. Every individual has a unique story, but it certainly captures the plight, the suffering, and the burden of the Jewish people because of Hitler and his regime and the communists that followed afterwards. It's a powerful story. It's a powerful book. Lessons that are extremely valuable, not just for your children, but for my children and for children and people around the world. The name of the book is The Daughter Who Sold Her Mother. Irena Powell delivers a gripping Holocaust survival story that reveals the complicated, tender legacy between mothers and daughters shaped by trauma and displacement. Irena, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank
I
you.
appreciate your time, your insight, the wonderful heart you have shared with us of your mother and yourself in this interview. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time.